Hello?
Oh, hey, can you hear me?
I could hear you. What do you want, buddy?
I don't know. People just called me and they said that we should have somewhat of a debate, if you're interested.
Yeah, okay. How do you think we're going to get to communism in society today, my dude?
Well, I mean, is that really the best question to be asking?
Okay, what's the best question to be asking?
Well, from what I was hearing of you, you seem to kind of have the idea that most communists and socialists and anarchists are primarily interested in kind of sitting around talking about utopias, the old stereotype about the first year philosophy student, taking a drag on his joint and thinking about how perfect the future will be. I don't really think that's accurate, and I don't think that most socialists, especially not just teenage meme lords on the internet, but people out there with DSA are really organizing. I don't think that's what they're focused on.
Okay, what are we focused on?
Well, obviously views different, and the left and socialism is pretty multifaceted. There's a lot of different branches. But I would say most of those branches have something of an ideal which they would like to move towards, which is generally workers owning or controlling the means of production in some meaningful sense. And they have different ideas to get there. But a lot of those things they pay dividends in the very short term. So, for example, if you're a union organizer, you do have some sort of a long-term ideal, right? Mm-hmm. But in the short term, it actually helps workers if they're more organized, they have more workers' rights, maybe they have better wages and benefits and things like that.
Okay.
So, just to say that, okay, if you're a union organizer, you don't actually care about the short term, and you just really want to think about your communist utopia where wages don't even exist. So why would you care about the short term where you do have to get wages? I think that's a little inaccurate. And I do think, if you're a union organizer, you may very well be a communist or a socialist, but you're also concerned about real benefits in the short term.
Why do unions imply communism or socialism?
Well, they don't necessarily. You can certainly have
unions well situated inside a
right, like the AFL-CIO, right? Traditionally in the 50s, they were very liberal. In fact, they were very anti-communist. They ratted out a lot of communist leaders in their organization. They worked very closely with the American government. They were a big part of the whole McCarthyist scare era. Mm-hmm. But generally today, especially a lot of the scrappier unions, they tend to be led still by a lot of socialists, and they are looking for a better future. That's just one example. I just want to say, like a lot of the people doing real world work who do consider themselves socialists, they are focused for the long term and the short term. And they think that by moving towards their ideal, right? Like basically, if you have an ideal society, it's like, how Christians, no one who believes in Jesus and his moral teachings and things like that. And for the record, I'm not a Christian. But if you were a Christian, I don't think that you think you can personally reach that moral example of Jesus. Like, you can't be Jesus. But it's still a good moral ideal to have around, right? You think his teachings are a good idea, even if you can't personally live up to them. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good way to see a lot of socialists, communists, anarchists, and things like that. It's that we don't think that necessarily we're going to have our utopia in our lifetime, or maybe even anyone's lifetime. But if we try to move closer to that ideal, it'll be better for everyone, in particular the working class. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, I'm just curious what specific things you have in mind.
You mean under capitalism, or like how would we move closer to?
So the reason why these discussions, so I avoid them, and they're always really boring to me, is because I'm not really interested in talking about how communism or socialism works under like a communist or socialist utopia. So what policy moves or what decisions do you want to, like when you talk about like workers owning the means of production, like what's to keep a bunch of people from collectively pooling their money right now and purchasing capital and then splitting it amongst all workers, doing like either an employee owned program or like a stock share, rev share or something? Like what's to keep that from happening right now? Like, why don't people just do it now?
Okay, so that's good, because I tend to think utopias are kind of boring to talk about too, right? I don't know if you ever read Thomas More, but that book kind of drags. So I think it's not impossible to have co-ops. And I wouldn't say that, a society made of co-ops would necessarily be communist. There's disagreement. There's actually a school of thought called mutualism that stemmed from a guy writing in the early 1800s named Pierre Joseph Proudhon, who basically, his idea of socialism was everyone is in a co-op and there's some sort of public banking system and the co-ops compete, and that's socialism, right? Or market socialism is another form of that. But how would I, supposing I didn't want markets or currency, I wanted the communism of Karl Marx or something. How would I start going about that? And why don't workers just all produce co-ops now? Well, I think one argument that I don't really want to spend a lot of time on is cultural, and that not only people just not think about it, it's just not accepted. And some, especially in America here, where we have this sort of, rah-rah capitalism. The idea of workers banding together to buy out their own business is frowned upon. I would say increasingly less so. Are you familiar with Richard Wolff?
Nope.
Okay, he's an economist. He has a very popular podcast, and he has a sort of think tank called Democracy at Work. His podcast is Economic Update, in case anyone's wondering. And he basically, every week, he kind of will highlight a new example of a co-op being formed and things like that. So it's definitely more common, I would say, and people don't have this idea that it's like the Soviet Union if the workers get together and buy out their own business. But still, I think there's still some sort of stigma. More important arguments is that legally, the laws aren't really set up to have co-ops. And again, they are increasingly, but they're still, because it's such an uncommon sort of organizational form of the firm as opposed to the joint stock corporation or something like that, or a partnership. Not every state really has the rules in place. And I think the biggest difficulty is that, businesses are expensive. And if you are a relatively low paid worker, even if there's 20 of you, you might not be able to pool the money or to get credit to buy a business. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. So how does that change without changing like the whole government structure?
So while it's not impossible, I think that if we're looking in this direction, okay, we want people to say get more co-ops as sort of an early stage of socialism, or to move in that direction. I do think we're seeing movements in that direction. Again, legally, organizationally, maybe people will start making sort of workers' banks or things like that. There's all sorts of interesting ideas.
What is a workers' bank?
It would like a bank. Well, like sort of like another cooperative, right? I mean, we already have credit unions, but imagine a credit union that was focused on providing credit only to cooperatives, right? Instead of home mortgages or something like that, it would be like a cooperative business.
Sure.
Credit.
So forgive me for viewing this under my capitalist paradigm, but if co-ops could successfully thrive and make money, why wouldn't normal banks lend these people money?
In part because they might view them as a threat, and they do, right? Like the co-ops that do get credit often do get them from normal banks.
Wait, why would banks view co-ops as a threat?
In a wider sort of systemic level, I think.
Wait, so you think when a bank makes like an SBA loan or something?
No, I don't want to say like the bank managers here like,
he's like, these guys are going to turn us into communists.
Yeah. I don't think it's like that. Like he's the co-op guy, a guy in charge of asking for a loan on behalf of the workers comes in and he just pictures them like a cartoon with a Soviet hat or something, like, oh, it's a gremlin from the Kremlin. No, it's not like that. But I think, and again, these arguments can get really complicated because it's not just like the individual bank manager's decision, but it's how does capital move around in society? What are the legal structures associated with these kinds of loans and things like that? And also,
hey,
I mean,
Dusty.
Not just personal prejudice, but if you're not used to loaning to a cooperative, you've never even heard of it before, where the workers all jointly manage and own something and distribute the profits or whatever at the end of the day.
Well, even in your system, it wouldn't be all the workers. It would be an elected board by the workers that would manage it, right?
Sure, depending on the size. I mean, again, I don't want to get back into the details of cooperatives, and I haven't worked in a cooperative myself. I think it's not just representative democracy in that sense. So I think the whole idea about cooperatives and ideas of libertarian socialism, stuff like that, is that decisions are made democratically at the relevant level, right? So even in a cooperative, it's not just like, you can have co-ops where there's just an ownership stake, but you have the normal firm structure, right? You have your CEO, you have your upper management and things like that. Technically, every employee has a share in the work, in the co-op, but they don't actually get to make the management decisions. And there's other forms of co-ops where that's not true, where actually all the workers get some sort of say more or less directly at relevant decisions. But yeah, I think a banker would just say, I'm not used to this. Maybe it's a bigger risk. I think that happens. And on another level, there's been statistics, and I'll try to pull that up for you. I just had it up the other day. It was a nice, it's a co-op report by Virginie Peyrotin. What do we really know about workers' cooperatives? And they basically find that in some traditional methods that a capitalist might judge the importance and usefulness of firms, maybe co-ops are a little bit different, but they're successful in their own right. Worker co-ops survive at least as long as other businesses and have more stable employment. They tend to be more productive than conventional businesses. The average productivity per worker seems to be higher. They retain a larger share of their profits than other business models. And executive and non-executive pay differentials are much narrower in worker co-ops and other firms. In other words,
I understand all of this, but I feel like I could describe, and this could exist and already does exist under like a capitalist framework. So like to set something like this up on a somewhat capitalist level, I would basically create an employee-owned business where every employee is vested in the company to some extent, or part of the pay involves some sort of divulging of like stocks or whatever, right? Like to keep the employee personally invested. Yeah, and I mean even decision making could be implemented on the managerial level. This wouldn't require communism or socialism to do it, like such that like. Yeah, I don't know if that would necessarily be a good idea for all types of businesses. I guess I would have to think of like specific examples. Like, I don't think I would want, like, if I owned a car factory, I don't think I would want to take a vote on what kind of cars we build next. I think that I'd leave that up to the guys in, like, marketing and market research.
Well, you can. It's not like cooperatives or socialist ideas means you can't recognize expertise, right? It's like if you have some sort of a business that requires, I don't know, some sort of expert scientific input, right? For one, experts do disagree. So it doesn't mean like the expert says something that's the final say on the matter. And currently existing capitalist firms, with the top, very top down.
Experts disagree, but like if there was a room full of like 8 like high level political, nuclear physicists, scientists and everything that were having a discussion on who to nuke, and like there were some disagreements in that room, I wouldn't want to leave it up to like a popular vote after that. Like I would want them to come to some consensus,
Well, what I'm saying is I think people should still have, because experts aren't always right, I think people should still at least have the ability to, agree to accept their recommendations. And I don't think, if we're talking about nuclear war, this is...
I'm sorry, I used an extreme example, but like anything, like deciding like on how to move a company forward. No offense to the average person, but the average person's a fucking retard. I wouldn't want my job to be held captive to the votes of like how somebody wants to move a business forward.
Well, we'll say, they bring in an expert and this cooperative firm says, okay, here's our expert. He has this, this idea. And then the workforce can say, well, yeah, we'll accept their advice, or say, no, we'll look for another expert and maybe get a second opinion. Right. The same way that, if you go to a doctor, people do get second opinions, right? The doctor is the expert and it's very unlikely the patient knows better. But still, they do have a choice. We don't force them to accept the doctor's recommendation. And I think that's generally what socialism is all about. It's democracy, not just in the public sphere like we have now, where we vote for politicians and things like that, but also democracy in this very large amount of time we spend per day, which is at a workplace. And we would get to make decisions there. And that would include accepting or, asking for a second opinion from experts that give advice. Because clearly, every worker, if you're at the assembly line, that's your one job. You don't know necessarily about marketing or something like that. But you should still have a say, right?
Maybe. I'm not sure. I guess the thing that I'm having big trouble with is it seems like you could do all of this right now under a capitalist system. Like you could make
and like I said, increasingly people are, and we did studies that cooperatives are more productive and employment's longer lasting. But they also aren't as aggressive, right? And I think that's one big reason that they tend not to expand, with a few exceptions. I think there's Mondragon Corporation in Spain, which has its own problems, but it's an extremely large co-op with like hundreds of thousands of workers.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a few examples like that in the world, but most of them are pretty small. And I think what they do, when they do form, if the workers can get the capital together and get the loan and things like that, they tend to focus on what's good for the workers, which may not necessarily be the same business plan as aggressively expanding, right? Because that tends to require, lowering the wages and costs as much as possible, making decisions based on, just as cutthroat as possible, as opposed to what the community might need. If most firms, if they're in a community and it might double their profits to, say, pollute and just like destroy the local water supply and then move on, I mean, a lot of the management will think really hard before saying no, or maybe they'll just try to cover it up and do it anyway. Whereas a worker-owned firm and worker-controlled firm, I mean, why would they do that, right? They have to live there. They're not going to move away. They wouldn't destroy their own water supply. So things like this can make them less competitive in terms of, the Wall Street movie sense, Gordon Gekko. That makes them much less like that, but much more successful in terms of stable employment, good paying jobs, things like that.
Sure. I don't know if I necessarily buy that example. That assumes that all the pollution damage being done by a company is being done by workers who are directly suffering that. It's possible to pollute in a way that affects other people. For instance, dumping into a river that flows downstream to affect people that don't work for that company, right?
That's true. And I mean, you can also make these sort of tragedy of commons arguments for everything. I think at least at the very least...
Well, I'm just saying that I don't think that, because the implication there was that this sort of co-op system solves externalities of some types, and I don't think that's necessarily
No, it reduces them. I would say it reduces them. I wouldn't say they would be eliminated, right? I mean, you could have a bunch of people, right, and they could say, well, to hell with that city downstream. We'll just...
I guess it's just it seems like these same pressures could also exist in a market system, too. Like, look how many people are selecting restaurants based on how much they adhere to responsible farming practices and going green and all that. Like, these are market selections that have been made into a capitalist system as well, right?
Well, I think information asymmetries come into play there in a big way.
But that exists in any society, socialism or capitalism, right?
They do. And again, it's like how you respond to these problems, right? Oh, tragedy of commons arguments, information asymmetry arguments. Do different structures of economic production respond to those problems differently? And I think they do. I think no system is perfect. No system would ever reduce them. And, and because you find this uninteresting, I mean, I've mostly talked just about co-ops, which can coexist perfectly under capitalism. I mean, this professor I talked about, Richard Wolff, his whole argument is let the different ideas of production compete, within capitalism, have a top-down CEO management structure and a worker-owned structure competing to see what people like best, right? And yeah, exactly. I mean, we're not even talking about like what a socialist society, how they would handle these things. But I think if you give average everyday people the power to make decisions over their workplace that might impact their community or their friends or their friends' community or their family, I think they will tend to make less destructive and less aggressive decisions than if you're a CEO who can move anywhere in the world, who has unlimited money and will never face the negative consequences of something like pollution.
I mean, that's a great hypothetical, but we don't know if that would bear out in reality. I mean, that's just conjecture, right?
The studies we have seen there's not been a lot of studies of co-ops and pollution, right? Because
I'm just saying that we can.
Small.
Well, this is one of the big reasons why I hate this conversation, is because we can point out a lot of very real flaws in capitalism, but in your socialist utopia, everybody is functioning exactly as you want them to. Like, I could spin off a million different ways that that people would fuck with their co-op. Like, say somebody brings in an expert and the expert misleads people or something, and now instead of having somebody that's educated enough to understand what's going on, you've got a bunch of people voting on bad regulations for their own company, and they think they're doing themselves a favor, and then people get fucked. Or say, because you're kind of in a tyranny of the majority situation, although maybe you would suggest a different voting system or a representative system, say that you've got one neighborhood that would be fucked but 9 of them that would be perfect. Why wouldn't most of the workers just vote to fuck the one neighborhood and keep the 9 in a system system where under capitalism, the marketing exec would realize that fucking over one neighborhood would be bad PR and he'd stop it. Like for hypotheticals, like this is like the big problem is that like I could think of a million hypotheticals where socialism or communism or co-ops like function absolutely flawlessly. But I mean, capitalism will never live up to an idealized version of any economic system.
No system will live up to idealized forms of itself, and that's why every human society ever has had serious problems, way back to hunter-gatherers, right? I think the idea here is not that everyone's going to act in this idealized way. It's that we're looking at how decisions are made and how problems may arise, and then, maybe this is just my personal bias, but I think that when you give average, everyday people at workplace or in the public information and the ability to make decisions, they will tend to make good ones, or at least ones that are.
I mean, the public voted for Trump,
right? But what was my, I said, informed people making,
how much more informed can you be about the presidential election?
I don't want to say no, and actually, I don't believe that people who voted for Trump are merely uninformed. I want to, like with Trump and the general, if you look at the way democracy in the West is heading, the elites, and I hate using that word, right? It sounds so conspiratorial. But people in positions of power, the rich have, for the last 34 years, have really been screwing people over, giving them very little choice in democracy. As informed as you wanted to be in that it was just Clinton versus Trump, right? There was no real third-party option. I mean, you could have voted, but you knew they weren't going to win. And that Clinton had some shady things in her past, and certainly Trump did an enormous amount of shady things in his past. And you knew that both the parties backing them really don't have the people's best interests at heart. They're much more concerned about their donors. It came out, who was that guy, Stephen Klubeck, who was on the news basically getting mad about Bernie Sanders because he was talking about how the donors shouldn't have as much power as they do in the Democratic Party, and this guy's threatening to pull his money. I mean, we both know that both the big parties just, they're certainly, they're not monoliths, but they respond much more to big donors. I think that was the political science argument made by, it wasn't Thomas Ferguson. It was these two guys came out with a paper. Remember the oligarchy paper? That's what people paraphrase it as.
Sure.
And it was, the preferences of the rich and the connected matter a lot more than the average person in terms of policy. So people have kind of seen this over the last 40 years. They've seen their jobs, the link between productivity per worker and actual compensation per worker has been severed almost entirely since the 70s. And people are getting more and more angry and more desperate. And at some point, angry and desperate people are going to take when someone like Trump comes along, it's a bad bet. And I think most of Trump voters, a lot of them at least, realize it was a bad bet. But Clinton was a certain vote for nothing really changing, just a slow decline. And Trump was a bet that, it'll probably get worse, but maybe it'll get better. And I don't really blame people for taking that vote in the abstract. So, if we weren't in that situation where there was people had a lot more information, they had a lot more choices, things like that, I think that vote would have went very differently, right? So, yes, Trump, okay, democracy sucks, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's true. I think that's a very specific, a specific dynamic to where we are right now and how messed up.
What about Brexit? Was that a specific dynamic too?
Well, think about the same thing with Trump, right? A lot of people, remember he had that rash of news articles a couple days after people said they didn't actually want to vote for Brexit, right? They just wanted to teach everyone a lesson, the elites or whatever, the people in the city of London, they just wanted to say, F off, right? So I think there's something similar, right? They just wanted to show their anger and desperation, right? And some of them wanted to just take a vote, things have been getting so bad for them.
So this is our excuse for people voting bad. Let's say that there's a company that's just doing bad for reasons, and we don't really know why, and it's just doing bad. What's to keep the people from voting for a really bad worker movement place, like a direction for the company when some crazy guy comes along, because now they're all pissed off? It seems like you have the same problem now that could manifest in that system, except now that's also affecting you economically as well.
Well, because one company is unlikely to be very big. And even if it didn't happen, it wouldn't have the same effect as electing a Donald Trump to presidency or doing the Brexit, which is causing untold amounts of chaos, right?
Are co-ops not allowed to reach a certain size, or?
I think that most firms and if you're talking about firms, and again, socialism isn't necessarily about just having a bunch of co-ops. That's a market socialism or mutualism, and a lot of socialists even disagree with that. But sticking with that, firms often have decreasing returns to scale at some point. Technology is most productive at a certain scale, and if you go beyond that, like banking in today's finance sector, a lot of the banks are just too big. They're over their optimal scale. And
what?
just
I thought that economically, I thought that was the opposite. That typically, the larger in size you are, the more efficient your supply chain and everything becomes.
But to a certain point, right?
Then why do companies like Walmart exist? That's like way past any point that I would imagine would be inefficient. No,
depends on the industry, right? If you look at Walmart, what they're just doing is duplicating their same store over more and more places. If you look at a bank, it's a bigger and bigger pot of money, right? There's been studies, I think, in the finance sector, right, and it does seem like they're into a region of decreasing returns to scale. Although that's always hard to sort out with all the sort of identification problems and things like that in those studies. For something, here's a good example. The returns to scale really depend on the state of your infrastructure and things like that. Mm-hmm. So if you look at South Korea, were they the chaebols? I don't know how to pronounce it. I don't speak any Korean. Maybe you know.
Wait, what?
They were like
word?
The Chaebol. I think that was the name.
Chaebol. Oh, Chaebol maybe? I don't know. Chaebol?
Yeah, they're like really big vertically integrated firms. So it would basically be a company, and they might start off just selling, like trucks, right? Or not trucks, selling, maybe they're a beer company. Mm-hmm. And it turns out because, South Korean infrastructure until, a few decades ago, it was really poor. So the beer company would say, you know what, there's not really good roads or transportation here. So they'd have to make their own truck company. And then they'd have their own shipping company because there's no one to ship the beer. And they'd end up becoming vertically integrated and very sprawling, right? So the beer company would own its own trucks and shipping and, things like that. Mm-hmm. So, and that's because infrastructure was very poor. And as infrastructure improved, right, this is, was it Ronald Coase made this argument or someone like this? The transaction costs decrease from just operating in the market. Right, it's better to spin off some of these things and hire the services in the market than to kind of take on all the overhead on your own. So the chaebols kind of been, they have, they're politically connected and they have a legacy now, right? But if South Korea's industry started all over today with the infrastructure they have, it's very unlikely that they would have these big, sprawling companies that do 1,000 things. They would mostly focus on one thing. So, economies of scale, they do have limits, right? And you could also say, okay, why wouldn't Walmart just or Jeff Bezos or whatever, there'd be like 2 companies in the world, right? Mm-hmm. Because economies of scale do have a limit, right? And depends on what you do. So co-ops, I'm sure some can get very big. I mentioned Mondragon, I think has 100,000 employees or something, plus a lot of contractors. They can get big, but I don't think they're ever going to get big enough to the point where one company has the fate of an entire region in its hands, like Trump or the Brexit disaster.
Okay.
Right. This is most, look at a convenience store. How big is that realistically going to scale up? You might have a chain of convenience stores.
Well, there are some things like banks, ISPs, I think and oil. OPEC is pretty huge.
OPEC isn't a firm, though, right? It's
but it's a conglomeration. Yeah, sure. But
but it's different. It's nation states. It's not even a firm. OPEC is just a bunch of companies a bunch of countries that gang together to make joint decisions in order to set the oil price.
Sure.
I think. How do I say this? Yeah, if you're looking, different industries have different sizes, but a lot of them in today's society are so politically connected, and this is what the libertarians like to talk about, crony capitalism, right? Mm-hmm. That tends to happen when you get to a certain size, and even if you are less efficient than maybe a smaller competitor, it works in your favor because you have these political connections and you can stay together. So I would say something like Comcast or oil and gas companies, the latter become part of national security. And then you have, in finance, you have the too big to fail thing. Do you know, there's been a few studies about the amount of billions of dollars of implicit state subsidies have gone to banks like Goldman Sachs and Citigroup and things like that. Mm-hmm. Basically, from the too big to fail subsidy, they can loan money at lower interest rates because there's this implicit the government will protect them factor than otherwise. So, I mean, finance is basically taking a rent out of the society at this point. It's much bigger than it should be.
Sure.
So, yeah, I mean, going back to that, worker co-ops, yes. Any one co-op might make disastrous decisions, and I would expect them to. But is that an argument against co-ops? Probably not, considering that every day now we have huge amounts of capitalist companies making even more disastrous decisions, and they can get so large and so connected that those decisions make waves far beyond any small region, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I can move on a little bit if you don't mind.
Sure.
Because we're just talking about cooperatives and specifically, and again, that's one model. A lot of socialists don't really believe if you had a nation of co-ops competing with each other, that it would really be a deep and meaningful form of socialism. I tend to agree with that. I personally consider myself a libertarian socialist or an anarchist, and I think that form of socialism, it has a different intellectual pedigree than Marxists, right? The Marxist-Leninists or the tankies or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes, you can almost draw, I wouldn't say from John Stuart Mill and the classical liberals, but it has a lot in common with them. And I find, what anarchism and libertarian socialism provide me is a way to think about institutions in society and to criticize them and to try and suggest ways that they can be replaced or with better things. So I don't know, if you want to talk about that a little bit, I'd be happy to.
Well, yeah. So what are some? I'm still at the point where I'm waiting to hear what's something that can be changed today. What is a direction that would move us towards socialism or communism that would make things better, today or within the next year or two?
Okay, so, you look at what is the DSA asking for? They want healthcare that covers everyone, and they want $15 minimum wage, and they want better workers' benefits and protections.
None of these things have anything to do with socialism or communism, though.
They aren't. But they would certainly help. Well, they're related in the sense that this is kind of the first steps you do to build any sort of a socialist movement to get worker power. In the short term, obviously, it'll pay off a lot for workers. Imagine if people had guaranteed health care, right? I mean, that would be amazing. I've a lot of family and friends who just, have. It would help a lot of people in a lot of ways. Is it incompatible with capitalism? Absolutely no. Of course it's compatible with capitalism. But it's the first step in you building an actual socialist movement, getting visibility and resources. Democratic Socialists of America, DSA?
Democrat. Yeah, I think there's some guy from it that somebody wanted me to talk to once. I've heard of him, yeah.
Yeah, so they're basically the biggest, most successful socialist movement in America right now. They've really taken off since Trump, and I think it's in part because they really emphasize the idea of democracy. Their symbol is the two hands, the fist with the rose in the middle. You might see that there's Rose Twitter, right? It's the people with the roses in their Twitter names.
Okay.
So they've become most successful socialist group in America at this point, probably because they threw away the old hammer and sickle and all the Stalinist symbols and things like that, and they really push the idea of democracy. And what they're doing basically is they are organizing at a local level with unions and things like that. They're getting candidates elected. This guy Lee Carter in Virginia actually just knocked off a Republican. I think he was the whip in the Virginia House of Delegates.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's things like this, and this is how they get more resources, more membership, more visibility, more voters. People start thinking about, hey, democratic socialism, things like that. And you kind of have to start with these steps that, again, you might call them social democratic. You might say they're totally compatible with capitalism, and I would say, sure, I agree. But this is where you start when you're so far behind, as in socialism is right now. And it's no surprise that socialist movements have been beaten back for decades. You have to start at relatively small steps where people can say, hey, that's not true socialism, and I agree. At the end of the day, though, you can build on these steps. You start getting unions that are more powerful. They start building co-ops, taking over their workplaces, things like that. And at some point, you can basically build these movements that control more and more of the economy. You have people maybe in parliaments and houses of delegates and senates that can kind of make this process easier, or even just push back any sort of state counterattack when the government gets nervous about all these socialists or things like this. And this is necessarily vague, but because the only things we know for sure are these first few steps that are very concrete, but also not extremely radical.
Sure. I guess, like, my question would be, like, is there anything that could be posed that you think that I would disagree with? That, like, you think I've said that you disagree with? Or, like, because fundamentally, like, everything you've said so far, all these movements could still take place under the system of capitalism. Like, there's an analysis for all of these movements under a capitalist paradigm. So I'm looking for, like, what is that one thing where, like, you're like, okay, Destiny, well, what about this idea? And I'm like, whoa, shit, that's totally radical. Like, I hate that idea. Like, what?
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, this because I'm giving you the first very concrete steps. I can tell you, like, this is how we need to start. Yeah, fighting for minimum wage.
But again, like, social healthcare, certain types of wage enforcement, like, these are ideas that I would probably be okay with, but things like market controls already exist under the capitalist paradigm, like the recognizing that there are market externalities and failures that can't be accounted for by the market alone, or this can all be analyzed under a capitalist paradigm. What's like a thing where you're like, okay, but Destiny, you got to do this thing, and I'm like, whoa, dude, no way, I hate that thing. I'm a capitalist. I totally don't even see that's possible. Like, is there, like, anything like that?
No, I get you. Okay, so when we move beyond the minimum wage and union, the healthcare and things like that, I mean, at some point, I think workers will need to take control of their workplaces, right? You can do the legal way of just, every 5 or 10 years, the business cycle, right? There's an ups and there's downs. And the downs, market asset values tend to decrease. If workers have savings, that's a good opportunity to buy up businesses. Again, totally, under the capitalist rubric, totally normal.
So what would happen if, like, two competing firms opened up and one was a co-op and it just wasn't as economically viable, or, like, the workers took it over? Yeah.
Today it would go out of business, presumably, right? They'd find it harder and harder to get credit.
Then wouldn't it just fall on its face? Then how does this work?
Okay, well, at some point, because we do know that actually, the studies have been done, co-ops tend to be longer lived, more stable employment, things like that.
So I would have to see. So I'll dig through this on stream later. I'm not going to, like, source me now, because that's kind of mean and stupid. But, like, my common sense would tell me, or my basic understanding of capitalist economic principle would tell me that co-ops can't possibly be as successful as you say they are. Otherwise, everybody would be funding them. If co-ops were these amazingly successful firms that made money, had happier employees, better retention, more productivity, everybody would be moving towards this model. Why aren't they?
Right. Remember what I said, like, because they're successful in different ways. They're successful in terms of the worker perspective, not necessarily in the aggressive expansion sense. Right? And this is
but even if the worker perspective, oh god, dude, everything I say is tainted with my capitalist analysis. But, like, if we assume that the worker perspective is indeed better, then we would say this magical thing of utility. We would argue that there is a utility provided to that worker that would allow them to select to work at these other places for even lower wages. So when you say, well, it's more successful for worker happiness, but not as much for, like, economic gain, well, I could argue, even under my capitalist analysis, well, it's okay, because even under a capitalist system today, there are people that will choose lower paying jobs that have a higher happiness output, right? Because that utility that they gain is important to them, right? So I still don't understand, like, even if the company was less successful per se, like SpaceX and the whole gaming industry exists on the backs of people that are doing what they love. If you're an engineer and you want to be rich, you sure as fuck don't go work for Elon. You're there because you absolutely love the job, because those are some of the hardest, toughest jobs in the industry, right? Same thing with video game designers and whatnot. Like, those people just do it because they love it. So, like, I mean, people make these decisions, so why don't co-ops thrive under these same types of systems?
Well, for one, you're talking about compensating wage differentials, right? Yeah, if a job that's more safe, you'll get paid less to compensate and all this thing, or a job that's more fun or more family friendly, you might take a lower wage, of course, or contributes more to your pension. I don't know if there's any example of a cooperative, large scale cooperative owned and controlled video game designer. I honestly couldn't tell you. There might be. I know there's a lot of the smaller indie designers probably work on a cooperative model of some sort. I think that's, like, two separate issues though, right? What I'm arguing, right, is, like, they don't expand as aggressively because the workers decide that what's better for them and their communities is to distribute the surplus revenues after, replacing depreciated capital in a different way than maybe a cutthroat CEO might. That doesn't actually mean it's a better model to be a cutthroat CEO and expand as aggressively as possible, right? But I think it's one reason that we haven't seen cooperatives take over, in addition to the other things like culturally and the problem of credit. So you know what? Because this movement is taking off, I would say in 10 or 20 years, I think there will actually be a lot more cooperatives true cooperatives where workers actually make decisions in the workplace. And I think they will be in a lot more, places like video game designers or bigger companies, and you might be surprised. But, for at this point, I don't know, right? This is really a growing movement in the last fairly recently. But getting back to the point where, okay, where are you going to disagree with me and not just on the details of co-ops, right? Mm-hmm. I think at some point, even if the cooperative sector is growing relatively slowly over time, maybe there's a crash and they buy out some businesses and things like that. At some point, I think workers should really just rise up and seize their workplaces, right? When they think it is safe, they already control enough, enough of the city or the region is under worker control. I think they should at that point just say, hey, we're going to take the rest of it because private property does not have a theoretical justifiable basis. So I think you'll disagree with that. I think that's very far off in the future.
Sure. Why not talk about wage labor and slavery and all that shit? I'm curious. Go ahead. Sell me on it.
Well,
have you read? I'm just kidding. I'm not trying to pin you. Have you read Das Kapital?
Very little. I mean, that's a big slog.
I might just,
have you read Das Kapital?
No, but I'm thinking of getting the fucking audiobook and spending a year just chugging through it because apparently it's a big meme. But go ahead.
Yeah, there's 3, but I think Capital Volume 1 is the best because 2 and 3 I think were again I don't know the details. I don't consider myself a Marxist, by the way.
Okay, sure.
I think
just in this capital thing, okay? So talk me out of this, or tell me why I'm wrong here, okay? So you have labor that you can offer somebody. That labor on its own, though, is worthless. For instance, for me personally, right now, I could supervise a restaurant, and I could cook, and I could run a front of house, back of house. I could operate a point of sales. I can do the ordering. I can do all of that. I have the prerequisite knowledge to do it. However, if somebody else doesn't make an initial investment into some sort of capital that I can utilize to use my labor, I won't be able to sell my labor to anybody. So else. So it's like an exchange of goods almost, where I sell my labor to you, I utilize my capital while you utilize my labor, and then both of us create something at the end. You take a little bit extra because it's your capital and you need to profit off of it, and then I walk away with my labor. So why is this a fundamentally flawed transaction, or why is this an immoral transaction?
Right, and you can make a utility curve and show that everyone's better off. There's producer, consumer surplus, things like that. Sure, and capitalism is an internally consistent system. There is not a lack of justification for why people sell their labor.
Yeah, sure, but let's take a step back from capitalism and we're trying to establish. So tell me why this relationship is fundamentally evil or immoral.
Just because a system is internally consistent doesn't mean it's the best way to run society.
I understand, right? And that's what I'm asking you. We'll take a step back from the capital. Tell me why this is a bad way to set up labor, capital, and all that.
Sure. I'm getting there.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Because there's plenty of ways you can organize society that have justifications, like feudalism. Like, the social mores are the serf owes, right? This is a social relationship. He owes so much to the lord, like 20% of the produce they make, and in return the lord owes the serf some sort of protection or whatever. And it's internally justified, it's consistent, things like that. It doesn't mean it's obviously the best way to run a society by any means. So I think a lot of socialists start from this premise: there is no justification for private property existing in the first place, other than maybe some of, very vulgar utilitarian, it works, hand-wavingness, right? Without private property, society would be a disaster, therefore we have to have it, the end, right? Mm-hmm. I've read Locke, and people like Locke. I've read Nozick. I mean, these people, I just don't agree that any of these theoretical justifications for private property are good.
Well, so I would be careful in your wording there, because you say theoretical, but it's very much empirical at this point, right?
Well, again, this is the it works thing, right? So,
that's like what our entire system of medicine is based off of, right? It works.
It's all
theoretical too.
I don't want to say this is a bad. If private property really did work, even if it wasn't theoretically justified, I mean, it would join a long line of human constructs that really weren't justified, but they worked, so we kept them around, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think it works, and I think that's increasingly clear. Climate change and environmental destruction and species extinction, I think, are the best example of that and why it's not working.
This is something, again, and I hate to keep drawing you back into this, but it's like you bring up these big externalities. And I don't think it's fair that you get to say that under your utopia, socialism would address this, but under the real world implication of capitalism, it doesn't. So when you say global warming, or Sure, let's say global warming. You say global warming. Let's say that workers all own a factory and somebody is saying that they need to cut down on their pollution, but it's going to cause them to have to work more hours and make less product, right? Who's to say that all the workers there would vote for that? Why under your system is everybody like this selfless arbitrator of like moral goodness?
Well, I don't think they have to be a selfless, arbitrary moral goodness, but they do have to know what's good for them at least. And I think
but pollution is never really like that. Like, it doesn't really impact you in such a way that, like, because people are stupid. They think in the short term. Like, do you really think that a group of people who work in a factory would say, okay, we're going to work a few longer hours and we're going to make a little bit less money so that we can get rid of pollution? Do you think the average person would elect to make that decision?
Did you see Bernie Sanders going to West Virginia and talking to the coal miners?
What about it?
Well, he went up there and he said, this is a room full of Trump voting coal miners from West Virginia.
Okay.
And he basically made the pitch that, if you could have some green jobs that didn't pollute, but, paid roughly as well, had the same benefits, would you take them? And everyone's like, yeah. I mean, he basically won over a crowd of Trump voting.
Wait, that paid and had the same benefits?
Roughly, yeah. It was
but that's not going to be the decision. If a company has to make a decision socially between, like, I'm going to, I'm going to abdicate, some of our production in order to make the world a better place. Like, they would be taking a wage cut. Now, if you're talking about compensating them with some sort of government subsidy, well, this is something that you can do under a capitalist system, no?
Bernie Sanders, yeah, and it was a capitalist. He was basically saying we should have some sort of green energy jobs or whatever, and the coal miners basically do that instead. So, but the point I think that illustrates is that, people will happily not pollute if you just give them something else to do. You don't wreck their standard of living.
Well, if you give them more money, if you subsidize their job, sure, you can get people to do anything.
No, but I mean, like, okay, society, any socialist society, or in capitalist society too, firms aren't little islands, right? They have legal and social constraints. And I think that would be true in any sort of socialist society you want to think about too, right? Now, I also want to point out here, the Soviet Union and Maoist China were terrible for the environment. Clearly, it's not just saying the magic word isn't socialism and then we solve all environmental problems. I mean, what was it? What was it? Aral Sea or Red Sea or something that was like pretty much shrank to nothing under the Soviet Union. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
I don't. My history.
I mean, it was just
horrible.
I mean,
but all I'm saying is that, like,
Chernobyl,
you listed problems that were examples of what you believe to be failures of capitalism, even though these are like international problems. But you listed problems that you believe are failures of capitalism, and then you said that your system could address it. But I believe that that's only true if your system works in an ideal way. Because, like, I could give you ideal implementations of capitalism where, like, pollution doesn't exist in capitalism because the government implements cap and trade. People will be working as efficiently as possible to find the best types of green technology that will be subsidized by the government, like, I could say that under a theoretical implementation of capitalism.
Well, yeah, and the thing is, those solutions might have actually worked if we implemented them back in the 1970s or something, like a strong carbon tax and things like that. But I think the political economy of capitalism has shown itself to be utterly unable to adjust these challenges. So,
but I mean,
I'm not making an argument.
Socialism and communism have shown themselves to be completely and totally unable to even exist.
No, I don't think that's true at all. I think there's been a lot of really interesting libertarian socialist experiments
on any wide scale for any appreciable amount of time.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, there's the new interesting ones like the Kurds in Rojava, which are pretty small scale. But the Simihadi people in Madagascar did something like an anarchism for 300 or 400 years. We know revolutionary Catalonia. That's the big example that people trot out to talk about anarchism. Catalonia, I mean, it wasn't very long, but it did involve quite a lot of people. And what destroyed them was basically an alliance between Democrats, fascists, and Stalinists, right? It wasn't an internal collapse. I mean, it seemed like, economically speaking, they were producing things even in the middle of a war. And there wasn't any serious internal contradictions there. There's other examples throughout history. The Ukraine, like Nestor Makhno's Black Army in the Ukraine Free Territory. What I would probably say about libertarian socialism is that there are a lot of examples that are both not industrialized, right? Like relatively, like the Simihadi people, this was the 1700s in Madagascar, so they weren't going around with trains and airplanes. But yeah, examples of non-industrialized, industrialized, large and small, new and old societies. What we haven't seen is a large-scale industrialized modern anarchist region yet, and I think that's difficult because they're typically viewed as a threat and their neighbors try to kill them immediately. I mean, that's what we've seen. Stalin tried to wipe out I don't know how many anarchists. But yeah, I think that's false. I think there have been a lot of examples, and we can take from those and learn from those. And I don't, because they collapsed because of just violence, like a bunch of angry people killing them as opposed to some sort of internal contradiction, I don't think that it's really impossible to imagine something like an anarchist society in the future. You got to remember, capitalism, do you know how capitalism started out?
I actually have no idea.
Well, it was basically in Italy, right? These little, Italy at the time was divided into city-states, right? Like Florence and things like that. And basically capitalism for, 100 years or more was basically this weird little system of Italian city-states that it didn't really go anywhere. And then at some point it just did, right? It expanded quite rapidly and took over most of the world. And I think if you look throughout human history, a lot of societies and social systems and economic systems have been like that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that sounds like a successful system, something that starts and works really well, so it's infectious and it spreads and people pick it up. It's almost like a form of social Darwinism. Wait, what?
Well, no. I mean, it didn't spread. It took a long time to go anywhere, right?
Oh.
And I think, social Darwinism, I mean, it's a sort of metaphor. You could probably use evolution, right? It stays in one place. It's like that, what was that virus game? You make your own virus and it spreads over the world.
Is it Spore?
Pandemic or something?
Oh, Pandemic. Oh, yeah, I guess I hear.
Something, it's like that, right? It may not expand at first, and then it kind of modifies itself to find what's the best fit to social and economic conditions, and then at some point spreads. There's revolutions and things like that. I mean, I think a lot of economic and social ideologies, that's how they function, right? Not to take the metaphor too far. I don't want to say it's infectious, but plague ink. Sorry, that's what people said. There you go. So capitalism had a long time before it really expanded beyond its, Italian city-states. And I think the same is true of socialism. To condemn it because it hasn't had a lot of, striding across the world regions that are totally anarchist or whatever, and been pure, obvious successes. I don't think that means we can really shut it down and say, hey, we haven't had any huge examples, therefore it's bad or wrong. So what I did want to say before we, I guess, took this tangent.
Yeah, sure. That's fallacious. That's an invalid line of thinking. I agree with that. Just because something hasn't worked yet doesn't mean it won't work in the future. That's true.
Right.
That's totally true.
Yeah, and I think, again, the most important thing for me about these anarchist examples is that they were internally consistent and functioned well. It was just like someone came along with a bigger army and wiped them out. Right. So I don't think that disproves their functioning. I think it proves that people view them as a threat. But sooner or later, the historical time will be ripe, and maybe we'll see an anarchist society that spreads across much of the world. Who knows, right? I'd like to see that. I don't want to bet on it happening in my lifetime, but right? So I have to step back a few steps. Where were we? Jeez. Do you remember?
I think I was asking you why fundamentally the labor capital exchange was like unethical.
Right. Oh, yeah. And climate change in particular. I don't want to say that I know for sure that any libertarian, socialist, or anarchist society would be environmentally sustainable. I certainly can't prove that. And I don't want to just say, hey, I have a utopia, therefore it works. What I would say is that from what we've seen of these examples, they tended to involve a lot of indigenous and community-based people that really look out for the local community, and people like interested in the environment. And I think that could quite possibly hold true in a wider socialist society. And more than that, right, we don't really have an option right now. I mean, the political economy of capitalism is such that we can't get that $200 a ton carbon tax or that cap and trade program in time. I mean, it just seems like we're in serious trouble. We have very little time to act. And we just need to try something other than capitalism. It's not this. I don't want to say that socialism will make the difference and solve all our problems. I'm saying that we need to try something new. We don't have a choice.
Well, I guess it feels like there are things we could implement under a capitalist paradigm that would fix our problems, that would be more likely to implement than converting our entire economy to a socialist system, which sounds impossible without an overall, like, violent revolution.
I don't think it would be easy, but I think we could make a it's like any revolution, it seems impossible until it happens, right? There's a new book by Chana Miéville called October. And he's basically describing the Russian Revolution. We know how that worked out, but he really focuses on the pre-revolutionary time, that year of 1917, right, when Lenin came back, and all the events in Russia over the time, the fall of the Tsar, and up to the October Revolution of the Bolsheviks. Again, putting aside what actually turned out from that, this sort of like the spirit of the time, like when things were happening, it seemed like anything was possible, right? And it went from, nothing's going to happen to, anything is possible. And I think that, the same thing is true here. If we're really worried about global warming, and not only global warming, by the way, have you looked at like our collapse in biodiversity? Like how many, something like 50%?
Yeah, it's all related to environmental shit. Environmental shit is a really, really, really big deal. I would argue that it actually supersedes an international system, it supersedes an economic system and actually requires international cooperation to fix at this point.
We need some serious international cooperation. Now, that assumes that the world is always going to be divided into nations and countries and states, right? Which I don't think is necessarily true, but sure.
Maybe or maybe not. I know what you're hinting at, and a single state would probably be preferential for tackling some problems. But I mean, right now that's not changing. I
wouldn't want a single state at all. I would want a bunch of people that are they're living in different regions, and maybe they're politically linked in some way, but nothing like a modern nation state that just
Well, sure, but when you say politically linked, we're playing semantics. You're talking about like some sort of unifying governmental body that can exercise some form of authority over every state, right?
Well, no. I would say a federation of communities and in a sort of...
Yeah, but if it has no authority, it's toothless and it does nothing, no?
Anarchists believe, Libertarian Socialists believe, communalists, that's another group of people, they're kind of like the Murray Bookchin eco-form. They believe that communities should basically have democratic buy-in, and then they should kind of aggregate themselves into federations. Right, so there's a political structure there, but it's democratic. If a community doesn't want to be part of a federation, it can always leave. There's no formal top-down control over these things, and it's part of that principle of people making democratic decisions at the relevant level. Right, if you're in a community, well, the community decides where to put their new park. Right, but if you're in a federation, it might be like a regional garbage dump or something. Right, and that would require the votes of everyone in the federation. So you can aggregate up to, nationwide scale or today's nations, right? And then at some point you're saying, okay, well, everyone in the world needs to come together to figure out what we're going to do about global warming, right? But it's certainly not like everyone in the world votes about where you put your new park.
Sure.
Yeah. But anyway, moving beyond that, sure, we have these crippling environmental problems, and they do require international cooperation today if we're going to get anywhere at all. But when I say the political economy of capitalism, I'm just fundamentally unsure that capitalism could, like politically and legally and policy-wise, ever make the moves that are required in the time span that we have. Right. So, this is kind of a pessimistic outlook on where we're going, right?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I just think the flip side is ridiculous. You're essentially saying that even if capitalism could address these problems, it just can't do it quick enough, and we've seen enough empirical data to prove that. So then we need a violent revolution to a totally different form of government that will all work immediately, and then we'll address these problems. That just seems like an insane flip side to take.
Well, you know what? When you have very little options, you do what you can, right? I think a socialist transformation would be extremely difficult, to say the least. But again, I think capitalism has foreclosed the option of doing anything. We really just have to try to transform our society. Like, I wish 50 years ago I would gladly have said, okay, if someone gave to me a trade, it said 1970, capitalism did all these carbon taxes and stuff, but in exchange you never get to see a socialist utopia. I would say, well, I'll take that bet, sure, right? But that's not where we're at. Capitalism didn't do anything. The rich still control most of our politicians and political systems in very meaningful ways, right? Like, the donors have a lock on the Republican and the Democratic Party, and the U.S. is the biggest polluter in the world, right, per capita at least. So where is this $200 a ton carbon tax? We're like worrying about like $20 a ton. It's just amazing to me, like, how little time we have, how many red flags are showing up, and just the utter inability of capitalism to do anything.
It just seems to me like all of these are problems of the people, though. Like, these same people could have voted in for people that would prioritize this stuff, but they're not. They just choose not to do it. Like, America has itself to blame for its political system 100%. You just can't, you can blame corporations for I believe lobbying and advertising is pretty disgusting on that, but for a large part, America has itself to blame for its current problems and for the problems that the world is facing. So, I just don't see how these same people that have all voted so fucking horribly over and over and over again, if left to vote for even more things on a local level, would fix everything suddenly because of social. I just don't. That's just so hard for me to buy. If there was somebody actively subverting our election process, I would be much more. What?
I mean, the amount of the tides of billions of dollars in election spending and things like that.
Yeah, but you're talking about you're talking about lobbying. I mean, I still think that to some extent this could exist on a socialist system. What if the experts you bring in are friends with people that run another business, and they know that if they tell the experts a certain thing, that business will make more money to mislead the people? All of these same problems can still exist in a socialist world.
Because of socialist system, right? If there's no classes, for one. There's no people going around with huge amounts of resources, the equivalent of money if you have money or don't, whatever. And then a bunch of people who are starving and have no political power, no money, no way to live, right? I mean, if you squash these things together, going back to the ancient Greeks, like Aristotle's politics, right? I mean, when you have societies that generate huge piles of money for some and absolute poverty for others, the political system is inevitably corrupted. It might take a few years, it might take decades, but you're going to go downhill because those rich people that have all those piles of money are going to just look at the political system and say, hey, I could buy this politician, I can buy this judge. And they always do. We've seen it over and over and over in history, right? So, I mean, this is where we're at now. Formally, we certainly have democracy in a local level or regional level. Yeah, sure. I mean, people have a vote. But in America, we have a two-party system, right? There's no other real option of anyone that can win. You have two parties.
Yeah, but this isn't even a problem with capitalism. In my opinion, and I don't know enough about this, but I feel like the two-party system is a result of the way we vote. I think that if we had a different method of voting, where votes were tallied differently, that there could be three-party things. But I don't think or third parties. I don't think this has to do with capitalism or socialism. It just has to do with first past the post. I mean, that kind of system will always tend towards a two-party system, I think.
Well, I think it goes back to the Constitution and a lot of these checks and balances and frameworks and things like that. But no, I disagree, because I think the modern nation state developed hand in hand with the development of capitalism, and you can't separate the two. So the forms of democracy we have, people even say bourgeois democracy.
Isn't Australia a capitalist country, though?
Yeah, it has different voting system. Is it ranked voting or whatever? Yeah, there?
So don't they have third parties that are represented? I think there are countries with capitalism that have third parties that are represented. Yeah, I'm not saying two-party voting, like it or lump it kind of thing. That's not just an American problem, or it's not a capitalist thing necessarily. But even in Australia, they have tons of rich people pouring money into their politics. Sure, I'm just saying that in Australia, third parties can thrive even under a capitalist system, just because the voting system is different.
But even third parties, right? Again, the details of what's wrong with our democracies differs, right? And some are definitely more meaningful democratic than others. Probably Australia is an example of that, and I can't say I know too much about it. But overall, when you look at these people with huge piles of money, they're in every country, right? They make it cartoonish. And they do get to buy politicians and judges and policies they like in every country, right? Mm-hmm. Democracy or not. They might have less power in more vibrant and strong democracies, but more choices for the people, definitely. But at the end of the day, politics under capitalism gets steadily more corrupt, because politics is being driven by all this wealth and income inequality that capitalism creates, right? This is kind of like the fundamental, like, okay, we had the New Deal, right, in the 30s. And it kind of reset things. We came off the roaring 20s and the Gilded Age, and there was kind of a reset. Things became much more egalitarian. But after a few decades, people kind of forgot about the Great Depression, and this process of inequality piling on top of itself started again. I mean, I just don't think capitalism can escape this sort of making piles of money that turn into political corruption, that cycle. You might break it or delay it or reset it, right? If you're lucky enough to get an FDR instead of an Adolf Hitler, which, remember, in Europe, instead of getting FDR, they got a lot of real disturbing people, right? So, it's every time you play this cycle, it's kind of Russian roulette, because you never know if you're going to get a Hitler or an FDR. But this cycle, it keeps going on. You can maybe get lucky and just start it over again or delay it or something like that. But I think this is what Marxists, I think, may be vulgarizing this, but they talk about like the crises and contradictions of capitalism. I think this is part of it. And at the end of the day, not only where we are in this cycle, but in terms of the long-term prospects of capitalism, there are these very long-term issues like environmental, climate change, things like that we're just not going to be able to solve, no matter what sort of. I don't think it's the people's fault for voting for people like Trump or whatever. I think this is just a much more fundamental problem here, and it won't go away as long as some people have tens of billions of dollars, and some people are homeless living under bridges. I mean, a society like that is just going to generate these political results no matter what.
Sure.
Well, so I mean, this is a big problem, right? I mean,
I mean, again, I don't disagree. Like, I feel like I'm repeating myself. Like, I don't disagree. Like, these are problems with the pragmatic implementation of capitalism, and like we can compare this not
just pragmatic, right? This is the destiny of capitalism.
But I disagree with that. That's the thing. Like, in a perfect world, if every voter wasn't a fucking retard, I think that there are solutions that can exist under capitalism.
But you can't blame the voters, right? The voters respond.
I absolutely can blame the voters. Voters are fucking retarded. They're some of the dumbest fucking idiots. Look at the fact that Congress has like an overall approval rating of like 13%, but like 83% of people approve of their own senator. Voters are fucking retards.
No, that's because of gerrymandering. I mean, they specifically.
No, it's not just gerrymandering. Have you talked to the average voter? They're fucking retarded.
And who slashed the education system?
I mean, voters could vote on more education if they wanted to.
But it's very hard to. I mean, you get stuck in a process where the average voter... Remember I told you that political science study that came out a couple of years ago? It was like paraphrases the oligarchy study. And they said it's very clear. If you look at the preferences of the average people, what kind of policies they would like and don't like, and you look at the preferences of the very rich, the people who donate to all these parties and political systems all over the world, have a lot of control, what gets put into law in the United States is the preferences of the very rich, and the preferences of everyone else tends to not matter, sometimes very little, other times not at all. Okay? So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what voters want or don't want. There's so many gauntlets you have to run, basically, to get the preferences of the middle class or the poor into enacting those into law. Whereas if you're rich, you can just call up a senator or a congressperson and say, I want this law. Remember, I think a few Republican senators and congressmen were actually openly admitting that this whole tax reform thing is just because their donors are mad. I don't have the quote up on my computer.
No, right I think I remember seeing a headline, something saying as much about communicating with donors.
If you don't get tax reform done, don't bother calling me again.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
Yeah, of course.
About.
Yeah.
I mean, this is very blatant. I mean, this is ridiculously blatant. Like, how corrupt can things get, right? When people are just making policies they know to be bad just because they have some billionaires that keep calling.
Of course. I don't disagree.
Right. But yeah, sure, right? I mean, like, everyone finds this disgusting. It doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum, right? Certainly, this is not a socialist argument.
Well, people who look at their own political party don't find it disgusting at all. Like, my mom is Cuban and defends that Arpaio guy, the racist Arizona dude, the sheriff. She'll defend that. She'll defend that dude to the fucking death under any system.
Or Roy Moore. Look at all the
Roy Moore. Yeah,
Roy Moore defenders, right? They said it's because, what is it that pastor was saying? Because little girls are pure or something. Like, it's just disgusting shit, right? Like, this is, it's out of control. But the point is that just things are blatant now, but this is what capitalism just generates. It's not just really pragmatic capitalism. This is capitalism under its ideal form and non-ideal form. Capitalism again, it evolved along with modern nation states. If you go back to feudalism, the nation state.
I'm just saying that, like, I can propose solutions that could fix it under a capitalist system, and you could try to counter with, well, pragmatically, people will never vote for that, maybe, which may or may not be true.
No, I don't think they'll never vote for it. I think they won't even get the chance to vote.
Sure, yeah, you could say that because of reasons they won't get the chance to vote for it. So, but I can't critique anything you're saying, because in your ideal construction of a socialist utopia, you would say that it would never get this way.
No, but I don't. Again, I'm not saying that necessarily that either, right? What I'm saying is that we know what capitalism is like, and I'm not saying I know that a socialist society or an anarchist society, even though we have some good reasons to think. Again, we can look at revolutionary Catalonia, we can look at the Zapatistas in Chiapas province in Mexico. We can look at various other experiments. What the Rojavan Kurds are doing right now in Syria is very interesting too, right? They're in the middle of a war zone fighting Assad and ISIS in Turkey, and they're still making a more egalitarian society, right? I think all these experiments are very interesting, although I cannot say that they're conclusive. I definitely will give you that, right? But what I am saying is that we know what capitalism is like, what it has to be like, what it's always going to be like.
Well, we don't necessarily know that. I think that's kind of a big stretch.
Well,
no?
we have what, 300? We've had 300 years of experience, right? Give or take.
Sure, but it's changed slightly. I mean, like,
it has.
15 years ago, you would have argued that whatever Obama did would be impossible under the American system, right? It's
what did
horrible.
he do?
The ACA
He had the
shit.
ACA. That was it. And you know what? He didn't even push as hard for that, which was
He didn't even what?
Didn't even push as hard as he could have.
Well,
right?
no, they fought a lot for that. I mean, what we got in was pretty shit at the end, but I mean, they fought. I mean, like, come on, you got to give them. The ACA was historic. Like, this is a huge deal for the United States. It's a fucking failure right now, but I mean, the fact that anything got through was pretty monumental, right?
Well, he controlled the Senate. Didn't he have a veto proof already in the Senate and Congress in addition to presidency? Like, I think
veto proof.
Not veto, sorry.
Supermajority?
Filibuster proof. My bad.
I don't think so. I don't think it was ever that big, no. Because they had to make a lot of concessions to Republicans in order to get the final thing pushed through.
Right, but I think that's because Democrats and a lot of liberals they view this idea that we should make concessions and compromise and things like that as a good in itself, as opposed to just getting the platform or policies you want into place. But I don't want to get sidetracked too much, right? I mean, I think... I don't generally like Obama. I think ACA was certainly a lot better than what came before, to say the least.
Barely,
but it's worth noticing. Remember, the ACA was a Heritage Institute policy. It was Romney care before then. So it's hardly like this ultra-liberal or socialist thing.
Yeah, of course, because liberals would have pushed, ideally, for a single payer or something like that.
Well, a lot of them gave up right away. But again,
because there's no way to get a lot of people on board with that, right?
Maybe. You know, the thing, Obama for America, his sort of like grassroots pressure group that he created, and he wound that down as soon as he got elected. I mean, that could have made the difference between single payer and not single payer. But again, digression, this is not really my strong suit. And, I think this is kind of moving away from the original point.
Yeah, I understand.
What I just want to say is that, like, we've seen enough of capitalism to know that, okay, nothing's impossible. Maybe capitalism would change and we'd all live in like the libertarian paradise where all free markets are competitive and they're or whatever. But I think after 300 years we've seen quite enough of capitalism to know its nature and the sort of the limits of what you can push for and how it'll keep going this cycle of increasing inequality and some sort of explosion or maybe more mildly a New Deal and then resetting things like that. With socialism, I think from the experience we do know of the libertarian socialisms and the eco-socialisms and things like that, I would say they're promising. I don't want to make any guarantees, but given that we have these real world constraints, these environmental challenges, these very serious problems coming up, I think that we should at least try more of those experiments or try moving those directions. As unlikely as it is we're going to have a worldwide socialist revolution. Totally agree with you there. It's not likely to happen, but I just think that our back is up against the wall here and we need to look in that direction. That's all I want to say, right? I mean, this is when you're stressed here, when you have so many challenges, I mean, look for the solutions no matter how unlikely they are.
Gotcha.
All right. Anyway, this has been great talking to you, but I got some things to do. I bet you want to get back to your games.
Where are you? What city are you from? One of two.
I don't like to talk about my city. I know my
gotcha.
accent is from Canada, but I live in Minnesota.
Same thing.
I have family history from Ontario.
Okay.
And
gotcha.
I grew up there. Yeah, so, I'll be around. If you want to talk some more and not just about utopias, I'd be happy to do that. People can let me know.
Okay, cool.
Sometime. All right?
All right, I love you,
Good talking
buddy.
to you.
Thanks for talking.
Later.
Buddy. Bye.
Bye.
All right, did I meet my quota for the month of talking to lefties? Are we good now? Do we need to talk about anything else? I want to go get food. I'm fucking hungry. Am I free of this?